Mac, the Doctor of Digital.
And welcome to Love Letters. Love Letters, a collection of love stories of people get lost, get crazy in the name of love. Another week, another great episode. The crisis of connection, ancient wisdom for modern love.
So, in an age of unprecedented connectivity, we find ourselves facing what Scott Galloway calls a mating crisis, a paradox where the tools meant to bring us together have left many feeling more isolated than ever. The contemporary conversation around dating and relationship formation has grown urgent, even anxious, as traditional patterns dissolve without clear replacements emerging. Some have diagnosed our moment with characteristic clarity, pointing to economic pressures, technological disruption, and shifting gender dynamics as forcing reshaping how we pursue love and commitment. Yet, as we navigate these very real challenges, we might benefit from voices that predate our current crisis by centuries, voices that understood human longing, virtue, and community in ways our hyper modern world has largely forgotten. This conversation explores what early Christian wisdom, grounded in a vision of human flourishing that prizes self giving love over self actualization, might offer those seeking lasting connection in an age of endless options and escalating isolation.
Indeed, and the relationship between contemporary feminism and the mating crisis seems fraught with tension. How should we think about changing gender roles, Mr. Mike?
This is perhaps the most explosive dimension of the contemporary conversation, where cultural battle lines are drawn most sharply and charitable dialogue becomes most difficult. Galloway and others observe that women's professional and educational gains have outpaced men's, particularly among younger cohorts, creating what some call a mismatch in the relationship marketplace. Some argue this reflects women pricing themselves out of marriage by becoming too successful. Others counter that men simply need to adapt to a more egalitarian reality. The conversation quickly becomes toxic, with accusations of misogyny and male entitlement on one side, complaints about unrealistic female standards, and hypergamy on the other. The early Christian tradition offers resources for navigating this minefield, though not in ways either contemporary camp might initially find comfortable. Let's start with Ephesians 5, that most contested of New Testament marriage texts. Paul writes, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord," a passage which has been used to justify profound injustice and female subordination. But read the full passage carefully. Before addressing wives, Paul writes, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." The submission he's calling for is mutual, a revolutionary concept in the Greco Roman world where paterfamilias, or the father, held near absolute authority over household members. Then, crucially, Paul's instructions to husbands are far more extensive and demanding than those to wives. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. As Christ loved the church, meaning sacrificially, completely, unto death. Gregory of Nyssa, reflecting on this passage, notes that if husbands loved their wives with Christ's self emptying love, the question of submission would become almost moot, because such a husband would constantly be seeking his wife's good, deferring to her wisdom, preferring her flourishing to his own advancement. The problem, Gregory suggests, isn't Paul's teaching, but husbands' failure to embody the radical servant leadership it demands. John Chrysostom, preaching on Ephesians 5 to his fourth century congregation, spends far more time exhorting husbands than wives. His sermons are remarkable for their insistence that husbands bear primary responsibility for the spiritual and emotional health of their marriages. He tells husbands they must love their wives more than their own lives, never speak harshly to them, and must consider their wives' concerns before their own. This is hardly the patriarchal tyranny we might expect. It's something closer to what modern therapists would call a secure, emotionally attuned partnership, though grounded in theological rather than psychological frameworks. So, what does this ancient wisdom offer our contemporary crisis? First, I think it challenges both the zero sum gender politics that dominate current discourse. The patristic vision isn't about men having authority over women or women achieving parity with men through professional competition. It's about mutual submission, differentiated roles undertaken voluntarily for the common good. and the understanding that in Christ, conventional status hierarchies are radically relativized even as practical structures remain. Second, it suggests that the problem of educated, professionally successful women finding suitable partners reflects not female achievement, but male abdication. If Christian masculinity is fundamentally about servant leadership, about using whatever strength, resources, or social capital you possess in service of others' flourishing, then a man who feels threatened by his partner's success has fundamentally misunderstood his calling. Augustine in City of God distinguishes between the lust for domination that characterizes the earthly city and the other oriented love that characterizes the city of God. And masculinity rooted in domination, in maintaining superiority over women, belongs to the former. Christian manhood requires the death of such ego driven posturing. But third, and this is where I want to push back against certain strains of contemporary feminism, the Christian tradition insists that equality of dignity and worth doesn't require interchangeability of function. Paul can write both, there is neither male nor female in Christ Jesus, affirming equal standing before God, and give instructions that presume differentiated roles within marriage and church leadership, affirming complementary functions within community. These aren't contradictory unless you assume that equality requires identity, that respect requires identical contributions, and that differences necessarily imply hierarchy. The early church held together unity and diversity, equality and differentiation in ways our culture finds difficult to conceptualize. When we debate whether women can have it all, career and family, public achievement and domestic investment, we're operating within a framework that prizes individual accomplishment above communal good and that only can only imagine fulfillment in terms of autonomous achievement. The patristic vision would ask, have what all for what purpose? If the goal is self actualization, then yes, you'll find traditional family obligations constraining. But if the goal is participating in God's creative and redemptive work, then the raising of children, the formations of disciples in miniature, and the creation of a domestic church becomes a calling of profound significance rather than an obstacle to achievement. I want to be careful here not to baptize injustice. The historical church at times did confine women to subordinate positions, did sometimes interpret complementarity in ways that denied women's full humanity and gifts, and did fail to challenge social structures that treated women as property rather than persons. The contemporary recovery of women's dignity, agency, professional capacity, and public voice represents moral progress we should celebrate, not resist. My point isn't that women should return to some imagined traditional role. It's that both women and men might find deeper satisfaction in recovering a vision of partnership organized around mutual service rather than competitive achievement. Calloway rightly observes that many young men are struggling to find their place in a culture that no longer needs their traditional economic and physical contributions in the same ways. The answer, I'd argue, isn't to artificially recreate conditions where male provision is economically necessary. That's both impossible and undesirable. The answer is to recover a vision of masculinity that was never primarily about economic dominance anyway. Christian manhood, at its best, has always been about protection, not domination, provision, not hoarding, initiation, not abdication, and sacrifice, not selfishness. These callings remain whether your wife out earns you or not, whether you're changing diapers or changing tires, whether you're providing economic resources or emotional stability or spiritual leadership. Similarly, women navigating professional ambitions and relational longings might find more coherence in a framework that values both public contributions and domestic investment, sees children as gifts rather than career obstacles, that recognizes the formation of the next generation as work that matters at least as much as anything accomplished in a corporate office. This isn't about choice, feminism, or having it all sequentially. It's about recovering purposes transcending personal satisfaction. In conclusion, while contemporary gender tensions reflect real structural changes and legitimate demands for justice, the path forward lies neither in rigid traditionalism nor in undifferentiated egalitarianism, but in recovering mutual submission as the organizing principle of Christian partnership.
Interesting, Mr. Meg. Indeed. You mentioned patience several times. Why is it virtue particularly important for addressing our relationship crisis?
Patience might be the most countercultural virtue in contemporary Western culture, which is deeply shaped by technological acceleration, instant gratification, and the expectation that good things should arrive on our preferred timeline. We've been conditioned to expect immediate responses to text messages, next day delivery of purchases, instant access to entertainment, rapid resolution of discomfort. This cultural formation profoundly shapes how we approach romantic relationships, and the results are disastrous. Consider how patience operates across different dimensions of relationship formation. First, there's the patience required to actually meet and know someone. In previous eras, limited options meant people invested time in getting to know potential partners within their existing social circles: neighbors, fellow parishioners, coworkers, friends of friends. This naturally slowed the process. You couldn't swipe through 50 people in an evening. You actually had to sit with someone across multiple encounters, observe how they treated others, see them in varied circumstances before deciding whether to pursue a relationship. The dating app paradigm collapses this timeline. You're expected to make initial judgments based on a profile viewed for seconds, to generate witty conversation immediately, to determine compatibility within a few dates, to assess whether this person is worth your continued precious attention before an endless stream of alternatives appears. This teaches the opposites of patience. It teaches rapid evaluation, high expectations for instant emotional payoff, and easy discardability. Second, patience is essential for enduring the mundane, frustrating, and sometimes boring reality of long term commitment. The romantic ideal promoted by popular culture, that relationships should be a sustained peak of emotional intensity and mutual fascination, is a destructive fantasy. All relationships have seasons of dryness, conflict, financial pressure, and simple routine. The covenant of marriage, as the early church understood it, is the commitment to endure together even when feelings subside, when attraction flags, and life becomes hard. This endurance is the work of patience, which the New Testament often frames as steadfast perseverance under trial. Tertullian, in his treatise on patience, describes patience as the virtue that preserves the soul's inner health against external assaults and internal passions. Without it, he suggests, we become volatile, reactive, prone to self destruction and destructive behavior toward others. Applied to marriage, patience is the necessary ground for all other virtues. You cannot be kind if you are impatient. You cannot forgive if you are unwilling to wait for another to change. You cannot love sacrificially if you demand immediate reciprocation or resolution. The patristic fathers would have recognized our current crisis as a crisis of volatility. We enter relationships quickly, raise expectations unsustainably high, and exit the moment those expectations are frustrated, demonstrating a profound lack of patience with the inevitable imperfections of both self and others. This is exacerbated by modern individualism, which privileges personal emotional fulfillment above all else. When satisfaction is the highest good, any prolonged discomfort is seen as evidence that the relationship is defective, not that the self needs to exercise patience. Tradition would argue that the deep, sustaining joy of marriage is not found in the absence of friction, but in the triumph of covenant over friction, in the shared memory of difficulties overcome through patient, mutual effort. Third, patience is necessary for the work of spiritual formation within marriage. Gregory of Nazianzus taught that the goal of Christian life is ideification or divinization, becoming more like God, who is himself patient and slow to anger. Marriage is the primary school of this outside the monastic cell because it constantly presents opportunities to practice divine attributes: unconditional love, radical forgiveness, and enduring commitment. But these virtues cannot be mastered quickly. They require decades of patient practice with one particular difficult human being. The early Christians didn't expect immediate sanctification. They viewed their lives as a long journey, a slow process of conversion. Modern relationship seekers, by contrast, expect partners to be already sanctified, already emotionally regulated, professionally successful, sexually attuned, and conflict free. The moment a flaw appears, they're ready to swipe next, failing to realize that the work of love is patient refinement. In conclusion, our culture's addiction to instant gratification undermines the very possibility of lasting, meaningful relationships. Patience is the virtue that restores the necessary timeline to love. It slows the entry into commitment, sustains the partnership through inevitable difficulty, and allows the long, patient work of mutual character formation to take root.
Yes, people, patient is virtue, as Mr. Mick talking about. You mentioned community support. How does community actually help individual relationships? And why has the dimension largely disappeared?
This is perhaps where contemporary relationship culture differs most dramatically from the Christian vision that prevailed for centuries. We've come to view romantic relationships as essentially private matters between two autonomous individuals, requiring neither permission from nor accountability to any larger community. The couple is sovereign. Others may celebrate their happiness, but have no legitimate say in a relationship's formation, maintenance, or dissolution. This represents a radical break from virtually all historical human societies, including Christian ones, and I'd argue that it's been catastrophic. Let me start with the positive case of what community involvement historically provided. In traditional Christian practice, marriage wasn't simply a private contract between two people, it was a public covenant witnessed and supported by the gathered church. The wedding ceremony itself enacted this, vows spoken not privately but before assembled witnesses, who then held the couple accountable to their promises. Tertullian, in the early third century, describes Christian weddings as sealed by the church, confirmed by prayer, and registered by angels. But community involvement extended far beyond the wedding day. Married couples existed within a network of relationships that provided practical support, help with childcare, economic assistance in hard times, shared labor. Relational modeling, younger couples learning from established marriages, and accountability, community members who could speak into conflict, call out destructive patterns, or support reconciliation. The married couple wasn't isolated, but it embedded in what we now call an intentional community with shared values and mutual investment in each other's flourishing. This structure provided several crucial functions. First, it created stability and resilience. When a marriage encountered difficulty, financial crisis, illness, conflict, the couple had practical resources and relational support to weather the storm rather than facing it alone. Second, it provided accountability. If a husband became abusive or neglectful, if a wife abandoned her commitments, there were community members withstanding to intervene, to call the person back to their vows, to protect the vulnerable. Third, it offered wisdom, navigating marriage's challenges, sexual adjustment, financial decisions, parenting approaches, in law relationships becomes easier when you can draw on the experience of couples who've traveled the path before you. The early church took this community dimension so seriously that excommunication, exclusion from the gathered community, was reserved for serious moral failures, including marital betrayal. This wasn't merely punitive, it reflected the understanding that Christian identity was fundamentally communal. To be excluded from the community was to lose access to the very networks of support, accountability, and formation that made Christian life sustainable. Paul's instruction regarding discipline in 1 Corinthians 5 presume that community membership matters profoundly, that exclusion carries real weight because the community provides something essential. Now, contrast this with contemporary patterns. Most couples date and develop their relationships in substantial privacy. They may introduce partners to friends or family at some point, but these connections remain peripheral rather than integral. The relationship is worked out between two people, judged by criteria internal to their own satisfaction, and maintained or dissolved based on their private assessment. When difficulties arrive, couples often suffer alone, believing their struggles are unique, lacking models of successful navigation, and reluctant to expose vulnerability to others who might judge rather than support. This privatization reflects broader cultural shifts towards individualism, mobility, and therapeutic paradigms that emphasize personal boundaries and self care. We're suspicious of others' involvement in our intimate lives, and with some reason. Historical community accountability could be oppressive, enforcing conformity, protecting powerful men while blaming victimized women, and pressuring women to remain in genuinely destructive situations. The pendulum swing toward privacy represents, in part, a legitimate reaction against communal overreach. But we've overcorrected, and the results are evident. Without community support, Marriages become fragile, overly dependent on the emotional resources of just two people, lacking practical assistance in crisis, vulnerable to disillusion the moment satisfaction wanes. Without accountability, there's no external brake on selfish or destructive behavior until legal consequences arrive. Without wisdom, transmission from experienced couples, each generation reinvents marital navigation from scratch, repeating predictable mistakes. Galloway and others document rising loneliness alongside declining marriage rates, but they often miss the connection. The privatization of romantic relationships is itself a form of isolation. You may be partnered, but still profoundly alone if that partnership exists in a communal vacuum. The early Christians would have found this arrangement incomprehensible. How can you sustain a life altering commitment without witnesses to hold you accountable, support to help you maintain it, and models to show you the way? I think of Basil the Great's monastic rules, which provide detailed guidance for communal life. Basil understood that human beings need structure, accountability, and mutual encouragement to maintain commitments over time. Left entirely to individual discretion, even the most sincere intentions gradually erode. This isn't pessimism about human nature, it's realism. We're social creatures profoundly influenced by our relational environment, capable of nobility, but also of rationalization, self deception, and weakness. In conclusion, community provides the scaffold that keeps us oriented towards our best selves.
Our best selves indeed. And Mr. Mig, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. And to wrap up, what recovery or community support for marriage look like in contemporary context?
Not, I think, a simple return to traditional patterns where families arrange marriages and communities police them. We've gained real goods through increased individual autonomy, particularly in protecting people from coercive or abusive situations. But we might imagine churches or civic organizations that intentionally create cohorts of couples at similar life stages, groups that meet regularly for shared meals, discussion, mutual support, and accountability. Not therapy groups, but friendship networks with explicit commitment to each other's marital flourishing. Premarital mentoring, where established couples walk with engaged couples through preparation for marriage. Postmarital check ins, where community members with standing ask periodically, "How is your marriage? Where are you struggling? How can we help?" Communal celebrations that mark not just weddings, but anniversaries, reinforcing commitment and allowing couples to testify to what they've learned. Practical support networks that reduce the isolation of modern family life, meal trains when babies arrive, shared childcare cooperatives, help with home repairs or elder care, resource sharing. Notice that all these proposals require something contemporary culture finds difficult: the willingness to grant others legitimate interest in your private life, to accept input and accountability, to acknowledge that your relationship isn't purely your own business. This countercultural move, recovering the communal dimension of what we've thoroughly privatized, is essential if we're serious about addressing relationship crisis at the structural rather than at the merely individual level. The theological principle at work here is the church as the body of Christ. Paul's extended metaphor in 1 Corinthians 12. We're members of one another, interdependent, each part essential for the whole's functioning. When one part suffers, all suffer. When one rejoices, all rejoice. This organic unity means your marriage is my concern and mine is yours, not because we're intrusive busybodies, but because we genuinely share a life participating in a common mission that requires healthy relationships as its foundation. Augustine in City of God distinguishes between the isolated individuals pursuing private goods who constitute the earthly city and the community of mutual love oriented toward God who constitute the city of God. The difference isn't merely a theological abstraction, but shapes concrete social arrangements. A community organized around self interested individuals protecting their private domains produces one kind of society. A community organized around mutual service and shared goods produces another. Our relationship crisis reflects, in part, our uncritical adoption of the former model, even by those who claim allegiance to the latter vision. The recovery of communal support for marriages faces particular challenges in our mobile, fragmented society. Previous generations often lived near an extended family or remained in communities long enough to build deep networks of friendships and mutual obligation. Contemporary Americans, especially educated professionals, move frequently for education and career advancement, rarely staying in one place long enough to develop the thick relational networks that historically supported married life. We're often geographically distant from parents and siblings, living among neighbors we barely know, attending churches where we're pleasant acquaintances rather than true kin. This mobility is partly driven by economic necessity. You go where the jobs are, but it's also a cultural value. We prize independence, the ability to pursue opportunities unencumbered by obligations to place or people, the freedom to reinvent ourselves in new locations. This value set directly contradicts the rootedness that community formation requires. You cannot build the deep mutual knowledge and trust that enables genuine accountability if you're planning to move in 3 years. You cannot develop mentoring relationships across generations if you're disconnected from both younger and older cohorts. You cannot offer or receive practical support if you don't know your neighbors well enough to ask for help or to recognize when help is needed. Some Christian communities have recognized this dynamic and responded with intentional strategies. The new monasticism movements, for example, involves Christians committing to specific neighborhoods for extended periods, sharing resources, living in proximity, and building thick community as an alternative to mobile individualism. Parish models of church, where members commit to specific geographic communities rather than church hopping, shopping based on programming preferences, attempt to recover localism. Co-housing arrangements, where families purchase adjacent properties or multi-unit buildings to enable daily interaction and mutual support, represent another approach. These experiments face real obstacles. Economic pressures often requires mobility, the job offer in another city, the career advancement requiring relocation, the housing costs that push families in cheaper regions. Family obligations sometimes necessitate moving to care for aging parents or to access better schools for children. Not everyone has the economic flexibility to choose location based primarily on community considerations rather than practical necessities. But the patristic emphasis on community as essential to Christian formation would press us to ask, what are we sacrificing when we treat community as optional, when we prioritize career advancement over relational stability, when we move freely without counting the cost of severed relationships and lost support networks? The early Christians often remained in communities even under persecution, maintained connections across the Roman Empire through letters and travelers, and created support systems that enabled them to endure hardship collectively. Their example challenges our default assumption that individual opportunity should trump communal obligation. I'm aware this sounds utopian to modern ears. Who has time for such intensive community involvement when we're already overwhelmed? Where do we find people trustworthy enough to grant them authority in our intimate lives? How do we prevent such arrangements from reproducing historical oppression? These are legitimate questions without easy answers, but the alternative, continuing our current pattern of isolated couples struggling alone, is producing measurable misery. Something has to change. In conclusion, the recovery of genuine community support for romantic relationships, moving them from purely private matters back toward communal concern, is essential for providing the stability, accountability, and wisdom that sustainable partnerships require.
Requires indeed, Mr. Meg. And as I said, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. People, the crisis of connection, ancient wisdom for modern love explores why. In an age of constant communication, genuine intimacy feels increasingly out of reach. Modern relationships often struggle under the weight of distraction, speed, and self interest, leaving many longing for deeper meaning and stability. Mr. Meg, would you like to plug in something?
Sure, I appreciate the opportunity. Write the book, grow the business, connect with me on LinkedIn, GMIC, the Dr. Digital Smith, PhD. Also listen to the Dr. Digital podcast and pick up a couple volumes I have on Amazon. That's On Track, Ian Hunter, and Burning America.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Meg, the Doctor Digital. And please do listen to our baby podcast, Mental Health 101. And of course, our Music 101. So, Mr. Meg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Till next time, Deus Volt.
Modicom people, see you soon.